Good evening from San Francisco. I'm Sam Gold. Workers' compensation fraud, it's a subject that's always in the news. We see video on television of an injured worker trying to beat the system. That's the deterrent that makes people think twice before doing something illegal. We read in the paper about employers who purposely misclassify their workers as independent contractors so that they don't have to pay workers' compensation premiums and other benefits, which gives them an unfair business advantage when competitively bidding work. In recent weeks, we've heard from Steve Poizner, the new insurance commissioner, that his department has a zero tolerance for fraud. But what you don't hear about from the DOI, nor see in the papers, nor see on television, is the number one cause of fraud in our workers' compensation system, which is insurer fraud. Fraud perpetrated by the insurance carriers themselves. It's an epidemic. It's rampant. But no one in state government seems to want to do anything about it, nor step up to the plate and stop it. After all, the money to fight insurance fraud in California funnels from the insurance carriers and the self-insured employers to the California Department of Insurance and is distributed to district attorneys around the state through the DOI's Fraud Assessment Commission, a group appointed by the governor that meets in relative obscurity and hands out millions of dollars to DAs who bring in convictions, in some cases, of totally innocent individuals whose only crime was to get hurt in the course of their work. Can you spell conflict of interest? I sure can. Tonight, we have on the phone a very special guest, Leonard Jernigan, Jr., Esquire, of the Jernigan Law Firm of Raleigh, North Carolina, who is chair of the Fraud Task Force of WILG, the Workers' Injury Law and Advocacy Group, which is a national nonprofit organization dedicated to representing the interests of millions of workers around the country and their families who each year suffer the consequences of work-related injuries and occupational illnesses and who need expert legal assistance in a very complicated system to simply get medical care and other relief under the workers' compensation programs of our 50 United States. He was admitted to the North Carolina bar in 1976 and is admitted to practice before all of the federal district courts of North Carolina and the United States Supreme Court. He is the author of North Carolina Workers' Compensation, Law and Practice, now in its fourth edition. I might also note that he is a founding member of WILG and is one of its past presidents. Good evening, Leonard.
Good evening.
How are you doing tonight? Thank you very much for taking the time to spend with us and tell us not only about what WILG is, and also we're going to talk about insurer fraud and a case that was out in the business and workers' compensation websites about an unusual case that happened in Texas where man bites dog instead of dog bites man.
Yeah, WILG is an organization started about 1995 or so, and a lot of workers' compensation lawyers across the country somehow found each other, and we've actually been getting a lot of documents sent to us periodically from ATLA, which is the Association of Trial Lawyers of America out of Washington, D.C., and ATLA was founded by workers' compensation lawyers in 1949 to try to help injured workers. That's where it all started. They changed their name, I think, in 1972. But along the line, they had bigger fish to fry, or so it seemed. I'm not trying to say anything negative toward ATLA because they've done a tremendous job and a very powerful organization, and what they do is they do some very good things, but they're not primarily focused on workers across the country like they were in the beginning. We started getting these documents, and I noticed that the problems that I was seeing in North Carolina were not unique to North Carolina. Now, fraud wasn't one of the major topics, but the drive to dismantle the workers' compensation system was happening in Oregon and Oklahoma and Missouri and Texas and other places, and we started seeing a guy from ATLA used to send us this information. And anyway, a bunch of us got together and flew up to ATLA to talk about the fact that we are getting, this was a national effort to get rid of these workers' compensation systems and break them down to the bone. They want to keep the system, but they don't want to pay the benefits as initially intended.
Exactly.
But unfortunately, after that meeting, the guy that was helping us from the Washington headquarters was dismissed. They had a shake-up there, and they let him go. So that gave us a signal that, ATLA, at least at that time, was not going to help. And so we decided we better help ourselves, sort of like you're doing, I guess, with your program, your organization. So we got together, and about 10 lawyers flew into Chicago, stayed at the Hilton that night. We never left the hotel. I don't think we even went into town. Set up an organization, created a corporation, and then we met quarterly, for years, coming together trying to put the pieces to the puzzle together. So we're still doing that. It's kind of a tough job because it's, we don't have the funding that we'd like, but we're trying. I'll put it that way.
How many members does WILG, we'll call it WILG, W-I-L-G,
Yeah,
WILG. How many members does WILG have now? And
We've got around, it's under 1,000, somewhere between 6,000 and 1,000. I haven't seen the latest statistics on it, but most of the people that join WILG have been practicing comp for about 15 to 20 years. So these are pretty seasoned veteran attorneys who've been around the block, and it's tough to get people out of their own states. I mean, people don't think, even the lawyers don't understand, unless they're well educated, that this is a national problem. It's not just a state-specific problem because each state has its own laws. But what I had to do to convince lawyers in North Carolina, and I think we have probably the largest contingent of members. California was probably close at one time, right behind us, until you had some reforms out there and lost a lot of members.
Exactly.
To educate them that there's a bigger picture out there, that this is a national effort to dismantle these systems, and the propaganda that goes on out there and distorting what's really happening, particularly with fraud and other issues, and lots of other issues. But to try to get them out of their own little world and see what's going on around them is difficult. But once you get them, and once they go to a convention or meet some of the people in other states, and there's a type of lawyer that sort of drifts into this workers' comp. They're not your traditional trial lawyers. A lot of them have come from people who had a working class background. They see their parents there. Neither of my parents went to college. I'm the first kid to go to graduate school, certainly, and to graduate from college. And when I see these people come into my office, I think about my parents and how I want the lawyer to treat them. And I hope that all lawyers would do that. But they're really, most of the guys I've met, most of the men and women that are in WILG are really dedicated to what they're doing. I don't mean to sound crass, but a lot of lawyers get blamed for trying to make a bunch of money. I don't think the workers' comp lawyers are trying to make a bunch of money. They want to be paid well, of course, because they do some pretty sophisticated work, but they're primarily interested in trying to help these people because, boy, it's tough. As you know, most of my clients live from paycheck to paycheck, and when that paycheck stops, they're in trouble. And from time to time, we've talked about the suicide issue, which I think is pretty drastic. I haven't seen any statistics on that, but I've seen too many. I've been practicing for 31 years. I've seen too many cases of injured workers and their families, their lives being destroyed when an injured worker just can't handle it anymore.
And since the reform, we've seen a lot more of that in California. Now,
yeah, I wouldn't doubt that. I think that's a national disgrace, quite frankly. It's not just in California, North Carolina. I was at a meeting in Kansas City 2 years ago, and we had a media fellow with us who was sort of trying to understand the problems associated with workers' comp. And he had heard about suicide, and he just asked the lawyers in the room, maybe 100 lawyers there, how many of you have had a client that either threatened suicide or committed suicide? And half the hands went up in the room. It was kind of shocking.
Yeah, I've had 2 in 8 years.
Yeah. And this case you're talking about that you mentioned is from Texas, and Texas Mutual Insurance Company is one that I have followed for a couple of years. I did an article that you may have seen that was published in the WILG journal. It's called Workers' First Watch. It came out recently, and I actually spoke about this particular topic in San Antonio last March. And I just went around and spent about a month of my time and my staff, looking at all the websites, looking at the different states. We try to track every fraud conviction, in each state, looked at their statistics, and I ran across this website for the Texas Mutual Insurance Company, and actually I've got it up on my computer right now. They say fighting fraud. Some advertise it. We do it. I think that's an interesting ring on it since they've just been hammered for committing fraud themselves.
Just like
one of the things I found very interesting when they have statistics and they claim they have a zero tolerance for fraud, and they go around looking for fraud cases, and of course they're primarily interested in, I assume, employee fraud. But when you look at on their web page, and I reported this in my article, in 2005, they showed that claimant fraud, they recovered $446,826. That's a lot of money, okay? But then they also report how much premium fraud was discovered, and it's over $12 million.
We have the exact same problem here in California. SCIF has just been, State Compensation Insurance Fund, who has half of the market, has just been investigated and audited, and it was found that this was a huge problem within SCIF. And another report of statewide employers underreporting payroll. And both of those are far outstrip any applicant fraud, which our insurance commissioner at the time thought was less than 1% of the system.
Yeah, that's been traditionally true. I did a report back in, one of the reasons I started having some interest in fraud is our legislature had a big battle in 1994 in North Carolina, and they were really talking about fraud. So they set up some fraud penalties. Fortunately, we got the legislation. You knew there was going to be some stiff penalties for fraud, but we had it apply to employer and employee equally. So the penalties are out there against both of them. But I had decided to go look into the statistics back then about fraud, and I was interested in how much fraud was out there because we weren't really keeping statistics in North Carolina at that time. Wisconsin had done some studies, Missouri had done some studies, even California had done some studies back there, and all of them, just down the line, showed less than 1% fraud for claimants across the country. It was remarkable. Yet, to this day, I've never seen a study that had higher than 1% fraud, that it was an accurate study.
Well,
so, interestingly enough, about, 1997, WRAL-TV in Raleigh, this is the capital of the state. This is a pretty big pretty big television station. They had their ratings, coming up. You have those out there, I assume. They're trying to gauge how many people are watching each individual TV station.
Correct.
So they would advertise some, sexy topic, and so they had workers' fraud. That was their topic of the day. Tune in, at a certain time, 6:30 tomorrow night. We're going to tell you about workers' comp fraud, and they had some, some clips and all that stuff. So I tuned in, and lo and behold, they said that 25% of the claimants filing claims were committing fraud. They even had a guy from the insurance department from North Carolina saying, "Oh yeah, all you have to do is fill out a form, send it in, and they send you a check." Now, I had been practicing law for some time, and I knew that's not the way it worked. I was horrified at the reporting and the inaccuracy of the reporting. I got the chairman of the Industrial Commission and one of the commissioners to contact WRAL-TV and their editorial board, and they really got quite defensive about it. It took about 6 months to get a meeting, but we actually went out there, met with the editors, and the editor was a well-meaning fellow. They had the actual reporter, a lady who did the actual reporting, and we found out. We asked him, "Where did you get this information?" And I showed them my statistics, how to say that's 25%, and to tell the public that 25% of the claimants were committing fraud was outrageous. And if you've got some statistics, show it to us because we'd like to see where you got it from. And they kind of sheepishly said, "Well, we got this from some private investigator who said this is what was going on."
Well, that was the first mistake, editorial liberties. To backtrack real quick, the case that Mr. Jernigan is talking about, as a matter of fact, as I said, on all the workers' compensation websites, a story just came out, which is titled, "Judge Finds Texas Mutual Insurance Attempted to Defraud the Court and an Injured Worker." A gentleman who was an injured worker was accused the insurance company of tampering with medical records. And the court found that this was true. And we ask, if this is happening in Texas, how many other insurance companies are doing this? Injured workers for so many years have said, hey, the doctor that the insurance company got, he's lying. He's not telling the truth. If it was an injured worker who said, I can't, I don't, I won't, or I never, he'd be thrown in jail so fast it would make your head spin. But when the insurance company does it, well, that's a whole different ballgame.
Yeah, I was looking at the report, and I don't know the details behind the case, except it was pretty well documented that Texas Mutual Insurance Company had altered some medical records, and according to one of the lawyers, he said that the evidence is clear that Texas Mutual not only falsified the original medical record, but after being caught, they secretly solicited from a doctor yet another altered document, which an official of the Dallas County Hospital District later confirmed under oath was not a genuine record of the hospital district. Now, that's criminal activity to me, and they got a $30,000 fine, as I recall, and we're supposed to post it on their websites. I was looking tonight to see if it was up there, but I don't see it.
It's not.
Well, this is really important stuff because there's a famous ATLA speech that was given, I think, in 92 or 93, that as this national comp reform was heading state to state, the carriers would use as a tool to the public and to force legislators to act, that fraud was the biggest problem with the comp system, and the system needed to be reformed because of worker fraud. And so we saw that used in California. They used skyrocketing costs and purported worker fraud and workers gaming the system to perpetrate the fraud that was done on 4/19/2004 when Arnold Schwarzenegger became governor here. And it's important for the public to understand that, and we continue to bring this to light, that despite the decade-long advertising campaign of the carriers, that again, worker fraud is less than 1%, and that employer fraud in the hiding of wages to get around paying premiums and underreporting wages, and carrier fraud in schemes to give rebates and reinsurance schemes far outstrips workers' fraud perpetrated by workers. And we need to keep, I think, pounding on this issue just as effectively as the insurance companies did for the last decade, and make sure the public understands that that's the other side of the coin, is where the real fraud is coming from. And any reform or future reform would need to encompass that, whether it's through insurance regulation of workers' compensation, which we had in California until about a decade ago, or some other kind of watchdog legislation.
One thing I notice here at the end of this article, it describes, you're going to love this, it describes Texas Mutual as a state-chartered company that operates as a domestic mutual insurance company with political oversight by appointees of Governor Rick Perry. Texas Mutual has lobbied repeatedly for insurer immunity from bad faith claims associated with the wrongful denial of medical care and workers' compensation benefits to injured workers, and refusals to pay doctors and hospitals, even when the misconduct was committed knowingly or intentionally by the insurer or its agents. That I couldn't help but laugh at. It was unbelievable that this is the pot calling the kettle black now that they've been caught, excuse the expression, with their pants down.
Right, and we've actually had a case like this in North Carolina a few years ago where a rehabilitation nurse hired by the workers' comp insurance company altered a medical record to try to reduce a rating. A rating is given when someone has a back injury or a permanent injury to a body part. You're not talking about zillions of dollars. I to this day don't understand why she did it, but that was not at issue. She did, in fact, do it. There was an issue about agency, But she did it for the benefit of the insurance company and theoretically at their request. But this case went up to the North Carolina Supreme Court, and our Supreme Court said, well, you know, there's an exclusive remedy doctrine that if you got a claim against the employer, and of course the insurance company stands in the shoes of the employer, the Industrial Commission has exclusive jurisdiction. So you had a bad faith situation here, has nothing to do with the workplace injury, but our court said you can't sue them in civil court. Now, if you happen to be in Iowa, there have been several million-dollar verdicts against insurance companies and their agents for doing very similar things. So it depends on what state you're in, unfortunately. And this is a real tragedy, quite frankly. People, you know, when you let people get away with this, it sets up a bad precedent. And that's what's happened in my particular state. And I don't know what California does about this right now, but it's a tragedy.
Well, California, you have two types of conduct that are actionable. One of those is fraud. The other is discrimination. If you're discriminated against for filing a workers' compensation claim, I think those are the only two offenses that are actionable and that you can skate outside of the exclusive remedy. One of them was brought to light several years back by a case called the City of Moore Park versus Superior Court, which was a landmark decision of the California Supreme Court that said if you're discriminated against, yes, you can sue them outside of the workers' compensation system. And, you know, from my point of view as an injured worker, the insurance companies think that this exclusive remedy is nothing but an umbrella to shield them for every criminal act that they may perpetrate, you know, during the life of the claim of an injured worker.
Yeah, but I'm not so sure how you know, I think this is pretty widespread, except at the same time I also know there are some very fine people that work in the insurance industry, so we can't have too broad a brush here. At the same time, I also know a vocational expert who, you know, North Carolina, if you get injured on the job and you're unable to return to any employment, you get lifetime disability benefits, and that's something they do not want. So anytime a vocational expert that they hire to evaluate the injured worker comes back with a report and says, well, it's either futile to send this person out to try to find work because of all his injuries, or the injured worker is permanently and totally disabled and so simply can't go to work in any capacity. The vocational expert I knew who occasionally would do that was basically blackballed. They wanted him to rewrite his reports. They told him never to put that in there, and he just said, you know, I've got to live with myself. I'm going to do it the way I professionally believe it to be. Now, that guy he lost a contract with one of the major cities. He was sort of blackballed informally by workers' comp insurance carriers. He eventually, you know, after almost starving for a couple of years, sort of came around and is doing very well now, 10 or 15 years later. But the scars of that are still with him. And what I'm trying to point out is that if you want to buck the system and do what's right, you're going to have a tough time. And because no one is enforcing these regulations and laws that are actually on the books, but no one's stepping up. Sort of like the whistleblower statutes, I guess. And, you know, we do have some pretty good False Claim Act litigation in the United States. And I think California has one too, don't they?
It's correct.
Yeah, and it's a very powerful tool. But boy, is it tough. I wandered around in the AFL-CIO headquarters in Washington, or outside of Washington, one day several years ago, and I found a book called Confessions of a Union Buster. You ever read this book?
I have not.
1993. It was published by a guy named Martin J. Levitt, and he was just a union buster. And everything he did about busting up unions applies to what's happened in workers' comp. I mean, it was deception, manipulation, packing the administrative boards and the National Labor Relations Board from a national level. And I wrote an article about that. Actually, it was published in one of the WILG journals. But he said in the early 90s there were over 7,000 attorneys and consultants in the United States who made their living busting unions, and a consultant billed between $1,000 and $1,000 and $1,500 a day, and between $300 and $700 an hour, and it was a $1 billion plus industry, and employers paid that willingly. He also talked about going and doing just some awful things. They would he'd get people to go out and slash tires and make it look like the union people had done this. And they would do things to the legislature and, give them misinformation. I mean, this is all planned and designed. And, the guy, as will happen eventually, he sort of collapsed and burned out. I think he became an alcoholic. His wife had left him. And the interesting story, the end story to me, was when he goes to a rehab place and he's sitting in this room with about 10 people, and each person goes around. They tell their story about why they got there, how they hit bottom. And at the end of each story, the people in the circle would clap and say, we're with you. We support your efforts to return. And then it got to him. He was the last one, and he told his story about all the horrible things he'd done, and they didn't clap for him. They were horrified at what he had done. And he said that was his first wake-up call, that he had really crossed the line. And I think there are lots of people out there that have crossed the line, particularly in this field, and it's really, really sad. But I'm looking for you for suggestions about how to continue to put the spotlight on this.
Well, we most certainly are doing what we can. Looks like our time is running out. So basically, we created this television show because, you can't tell this story in a 5-minute video bite like we did last month with CBS 13 in Sacramento. We did a piece with our fraud investigator, and because of that piece, our fraud investigator is no longer able to work for any insurance companies. They have blackballed him because he tells the truth. And, it's when anybody steps forward, whenever anybody blows the whistle, they're the ones that always suffer. But some of us, we do things, for the good of everybody. And it's really important that we keep up this work and we keep telling people the truth. Leonard, I thank you very much for taking the time out of your evening to talk to us. I'm sure we're going to be doing this again, and I certainly hope that we'll be able to talk about some of these stories and these important news stories as they break. Again, this is Leonard Jernigan from North Carolina. I'm Sam Gold. Good evening.
Good evening.